She didn't cry at the funeral, not once, not even when the casket finally lowered into the hard ground that froze up just days before the first snow came early that year. She didn't weep when the last few men rode away, mumbling what little comfort they could muster between awkward hat tips and boots scraping gravel. She didn't even blink when old Mr. Halper muttered, "She'll have to go back east," under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. No, she didn't break. Not that day. Not the day her husband died from a fever that outlasted their firewood. But that night, when her boys were asleep and the wind pushed its way under the cracks of their plank cabin, Martha Willows lit one log, just one, and sat alone by the faint flicker of it, staring at nothing. Not the fire, not the shadows, nothing, just listening to the storm howl and the silence that followed it inside her. Because what no one else in that town seemed to understand, not the preacher, not the undertaker, and certainly not the men who made wagers on whether she'd last the season, was that she didn't have the option to fall apart. Her husband was dead, her boys were alive, and winter was already clawing at the windows. The first night without him, the last beam of warmth vanished from the cabin by midnight. The wind pressed harder. The boys shivered in their sleep, curled together beneath wool and old coats. And Martha, hands red from cutting the last of the stacked wood that afternoon, stayed awake just to make sure none of them stopped breathing. By the second night, the last log burned. That was it. No more stockpile. No man to haul. No horse strong enough to drag timber from the river bend. The cold didn't wait for the calendar. It came early that year, and it came to stay. The third morning, she walked through town with the boys in tow, faces pale, noses pink, shoulders bundled in threadbare jackets, and asked if anyone could lend her work or wood. Not charity, not handouts, work. They said no. Some were kind about it, others less so. She should go back east. She's just a woman. She ain't gonna last. She's gonna get those boys killed. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was how they said it, like they'd already moved on from the Willows family. Like her husband's grave was already an afterthought. Like she'd never been a part of the town to begin with. Just a temporary mistake carved into the landscape. They didn't see her as capable, only pitiful. But Martha Willows didn't carry pity well. What she carried was rage. Quiet rage. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that whispers into your blood when you're cold and alone. And the only thing standing between your children and death is how hard you're willing to fight. And so she began, not with a grand plan, not with a miracle. She started with a shovel. There was an old slope behind the cabin where her husband once talked about digging a root. Cellar. He never got to it. Always something more urgent. Repairing the barn, hauling rock, patching leaks. But she remembered how he talked about it. The warmth beneath the earth. The way cellars stayed cool in summer, but somehow less bitter in winter. She dug with bare hands at first. Then a rusted spade. The ground was stubborn, frozen in places, soaked in others. But beneath that was dense clay, heavy, wet, and perfect. She didn't have blueprints. She didn't have strength. She had will. Every day she dug. Every night she sewed, repaired what she could. Scavenged, melted candle wax and animal fat into makeshift bricks. She remembered everything he used to say, every odd tip from old men at town hall meetings, every accidental lesson absorbed in the background of her married life. She remembered things because no one ever thought she was listening, but she was. She always had been. She started building what she didn't yet have words for. A chamber, a hollow beneath the slope, packed in with clay and stone and layers of sand and soot. Not a root cellar, not quite. Not a fireplace either. Something in between, something that could draw heat through the ground and hold it longer, something that wouldn't lose it all in one night like their wooden walls did. The men in town laughed. "She's digging her own grave," one of them joked at the saloon. Another said, "Should have been a baker, not a builder." Others just rolled their eyes. "She's just a woman." But Martha didn't care what they said, because on the seventh day, when the snow blanketed the ground in full, and wind howled like wolves outside, she pulled her boys down into that chamber she built and shut the makeshift clay door behind them. They sat, huddled, and for the first time in nearly a week, it didn't feel like the air was trying to kill them. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it wasn't freezing. The walls held, the roof didn't collapse, the wind couldn't find them. The chamber worked. It worked. And the very next morning, she returned to digging again, not to finish, but to expand. What she built wasn't a shelter, not anymore. She was building something bigger, a solution, one that used just a single log, because that was all they had. And if it worked, if she could get it right, she wouldn't just survive. She'd never have to ask another man for firewood again. She didn't speak of it to anyone, not to the men who mocked her, not to the women who offered sideways glances laced with silent pity, not even to her boys. When they asked what she was building, she only said, "Something that will last longer than me." And that was enough to keep them quiet. She didn't need their help digging anymore. Not because she didn't need help, but because she didn't want to burden them. They were just children after all, their cheeks still round with youth, their bones still soft, their hands too small to carry the weight she now shouldered alone. There was no time for childhood, not in the heart of that winter. And yet she tried to protect what little innocence they had left, even as she worked herself to the edge of collapse. Every hour mattered, every layer of clay, every handful of ash, every stone she packed into place. She remembered, somewhere in the tattered notes her husband once jotted in the margins of his almanac, the idea of heat traps. He'd never had time to try it. Too busy. Too tired, too much hope that next year would be easier. But she wasn't waiting for next year. She gathered stones, flat, wide ones, dug them out from creek beds and the remains of a crumbled chimney near the old mill. She dried them out by fire, one at a time, then used her dwindling supply of coal dust to smear the inside walls of the chamber. Layer after layer, she recalled how black soot clung to heat, held it, even long after a fire died. At night she tested it, a single log, cut thin, dried thick with resin, burned in a clay-lined cavity she had dug and sealed herself. The flames flickered low, controlled, not wasteful. The heat funneled down a narrow tunnel beneath the chamber before rising up again through holes in the floor she had poked with a rusted blade and her own breath. It wasn't a stove, it wasn't a chimney, and it wasn't anything anyone had ever shown her how to build. But it worked. It drew in air, then recycled heat. The stones, coated in soot and ash, absorbed what little warmth the log gave off and bled it out slowly. All night long, the boys stopped shivering in their sleep. She stopped worrying about them freezing before sunrise. She hadn't invented it, not truly, but she'd stitched together knowledge no man in town had ever bothered to assemble. One idea from an old book, one from a trapper who'd once mumbled about underground fox dens, another from a traveling tinker's tale about Mongols heating yurts with dung fires buried under clay. Half memories, half madness, and yet here she was making it real. But no solution is complete on its first draft. The chamber held heat, but the air grew stale. Condensation slicked the walls by morning. Moisture gathered beneath the boys' bedding. They coughed. She tasted mildew. She realized then that heat was only half the battle. Without air, without circulation, they'd choke on the very thing that saved them. So she carved another tunnel, a vent, an escape for breath. That was when the others noticed again. One afternoon, as she dragged a clay-lined pipe up the slope behind her cabin, a neighbor rode by. Saul Redtree, 40, stocky, his beard always full of tobacco. He slowed his horse just enough to sneer, not even hiding it behind words. "You dig in a grave, widow?" She said nothing. "Better dig too. Boys'll follow quick enough when you collapse down there." Still, she said nothing. He spat. He laughed. He rode off. She kept working. It was never about proving them wrong, not at first. But now it was starting to feel that way. Because every time someone scoffed, she built harder. Every time someone muttered, "just a woman," like it was a curse, she found another reason to survive longer than them. She wasn't doing it for spite. She was doing it for revenge, the kind only time could deliver. And that time came quicker than anyone expected. It was the night the town's sawmill caught fire. No one knew how it started. The cold had made the men reckless, burning damp logs too close to timber stacks, drunk on cheap whiskey and exhaustion. One gust of wind, one wrong spark, and the whole east end of the settlement lit up like a funeral pyre. The flames were seen from miles away. Martha saw them too. From her slope. She didn't run toward the fire. She didn't grab water pails or scream for help. She gathered her boys, pulled them down into her chamber, lit her single log, sealed the vent, shut the clay door, and waited. Not from cowardice, from sense. By morning, half the town's wood stock was gone. By dusk, the men began knocking, not angrily, not smugly, not with scorn in their eyes, with desperation. The fire had burned more than their timber. It had taken tools, wagons, blankets, and most of all, hope. The storm front that followed made it worse. Temperatures dropped fast. The wind turned violent. Tents collapsed. A baby froze in her crib. An old man died mid-step between houses. No one had time to cut more wood, and those who tried found their axes snapping against solid ground. It was then that Martha emerged. Not boasting, not smug, but prepared. Her cheeks were cracked with cold, her fingers stiff, her coat patched and repatched again. But she stood taller than any of them had ever seen her, not because she wanted to, but because now they looked at her different. They saw what she'd built. They saw smoke rise from the slope behind her home, not thick and wasteful like theirs, but thin and steady, barely visible, like a whisper of warmth. They saw her boys, wrapped and healthy, stepping out with clear eyes while theirs coughed and limped and begged for more blankets. They saw her solution, and they wanted it. That night, 3 families asked to see her chamber. By morning, 7 more. By the end of the week, men were standing outside her cabin with pickaxes and clay buckets, asking questions, asking her to explain. She never rubbed it in, never said, "I told you so." She just nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and showed them how to dig, not because she owed them, but because she remembered what it felt like when no one listened, and she'd rather teach than bury more neighbors. Still, not everyone liked it. Some men grumbled that she was trying to outshine them. Some refused to copy her method outright, choosing instead to burn twice the wood, cursing her under their breath as their stacks dwindled to nothing. Others, like Saul Redtree, stayed silent now. He never apologized, never asked for help, but Martha noticed how his chimney smoked longer now, thinner, slower, just like hers. He'd copied her. Quietly, she let him, because whether or not they gave her credit, her idea was spreading, and in the end it didn't matter who they thought she was before the freeze. All that mattered was who they had to become to survive after it. The snow piled higher than fence posts, thicker than the memory of her husband's last breath, and colder than the nights when she first realized no one was coming to help. But now, inside that half-buried chamber behind the cabin, Martha no longer feared the frost. She no longer measured time in logs or frostbite. She measured it in warmth, how long the walls stayed tepid after the last ember dimmed, how many hours passed before the breath of her boys no longer clouded the air, how long her hands could rest before they bled again from labor. But as the warmth grew steady beneath the earth, another kind of cold crept in above it. The town changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a fog that rolls in so slow you forget there was ever light before it. At first it seemed good. They came knocking, not to scorn, but to ask. For guidance, for a look, for help. Men who hadn't said a kind word in years now offered ma'ams and Miss Willows with awkward hats held tight to their chests. Could you come by my place and take a look? My wife says maybe you could show her how to pack the clay right. Reckon you might have a bit of that soot mixture to spare? And she did help, not because they deserved it, but because she couldn't stand the thought of more children crying through the night, lungs full of ice, dreams choked out by frost. Still, some of their eyes twitched when she corrected them. Some men didn't like taking orders, especially not from just a woman. She watched them closely, how they'd nod and pretend to understand, then do it wrong, how they'd build their tunnels too shallow, or skip the layer of soot, or let their stones soak in rain before drying. Then, when it didn't work, they'd mutter blame. She must have kept something back. Maybe it only works on her land. Maybe she got lucky. But luck didn't dig through frozen clay for 17 nights. Luck didn't patch her roof with torn dresses and mud when the store ran out of tar cloth. Luck didn't build vent tunnels from spare stovepipes and the broken legs of a dead man's bed frame. No, this wasn't luck. This was desperation weaponized into invention. She tried not to let the talk bother her, but it ate at the corners of her peace. It soured the warmth she had earned, and it reminded her that no matter how many children she kept warm this winter, some men would rather freeze to death than admit a woman had done what they could not. Then came the preacher, Reverend Hartley, 60, stern, widowed. He hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, hadn't so much as nodded when she passed the York chapel. But he came now, uninvited, stepping over the low trench near her cabin like he'd owned it once. She was fitting a clay plug to one of her side vents, hands raw and fingers stiff with soot, when he cleared his throat behind her. Miss Willows? She didn't rise, just glanced over her shoulder. Reverend? He nodded once, hesitant, like a man chewing something he didn't want to swallow. I heard you've been showing others your design. She said nothing, just set the clay piece, sealed it with mud, and began smoothing it with a bone-handled spatula her husband had once carved for no real reason but love. He waited. When she didn't speak, he tried again. You ought to be careful. When a woman teaches men to build, folks get confused about the proper order of things. She paused. Still kneeling, she slowly turned her head toward him. My boys are warm, she said. Are yours? He flinched, just slightly. My point, he said, voice sharper now, is that people talk, and it don't take much for a town to change how it sees someone. Too many ideas in a woman's head, and suddenly the men start forgetting where they're supposed to stand. Martha stood now, not fast, not threatening, but tall, and something in her posture made even the Reverend step back just a half pace. Then let them forget, she said quietly. Maybe it's time they stood somewhere else. He left without another word, but she knew the seed had been planted. Whispers returned, not of failure now, but of power, and in many ways, that was worse. The same men who once laughed now frowned behind closed doors. The same women who once offered condolences now eyed her with suspicion. Children who once waved now passed silent. It didn't take long before one of the town's 3 store owners, Mr. Graff, quietly doubled the price on soot, claiming shortage. Then the blacksmith refused to trade for pipe sections, unless she agreed to show his wife the blueprints, even though there were none. And yet in the very same week, 2 more families showed up at her door with tears in their eyes. One had a sick baby and no dry place to keep her warm. The other had lost their cabin roof in the windstorm. She let them stay in her root chamber. It was tight, cramped, crowded, but it held. The chamber worked, better than ever. The ground, now thoroughly sealed and lined, held warmth for hours after the fire dimmed. The vents worked in tandem, pulling fresh air through a tunnel on one side, expelling stale breath through the other. The boys helped now, managing fire rotation, stirring the stone bed, applying wax to seal gaps. They had learned not just how to survive, how to build. They watched her carefully, asking nothing, absorbing everything. And that, more than anything, frightened the men of the town. Because her boys were growing up warm, strong, and trained by a mother who knew more about heat retention and survival than any man in 3 counties. She was raising builders, not just sons, and in the unforgiving arithmetic of frontier life, every fire that burned longer meant 1 less log traded, 1 less trip to the communal pile, 1 less reason to bend the knee to men who believed they owned knowledge like cattle. So they came for her again, not with guns, with meetings. A town council was called. Only 5 men attended, but it was enough. They summoned her to the hall under the pretense of public safety. She brought her eldest with her, John, age 11, shoulders broader than most grown men's sons, lips chapped from the cold, but eyes steady. The meeting was brief, accusations disguised as concerns. You've created a public risk. These structures aren't inspected. What if the clay collapses? What if your method spreads and someone dies? They didn't ask her to stop. They told her to. Effective immediately, said Halper, the grain store clerk. You are to cease demonstration of any further construction. You may retain your own shelter, but you may not promote or assist others in duplicating it without a certified male overseer present. Martha stared at them. Certified by who? She asked. By this council. She looked at each man. All of them had once laughed at her. All of them had since copied her method in some form. All of them were now warm because of her. She said nothing, just turned and walked out. But that night she didn't sleep. She didn't even return to the chamber. She stayed above, near the cabin, watching the smoke rise from town chimneys. Thick, wild, wasteful. She watched the red flickers in distant windows, counted them. 15 homes warmed by designs she had inspired. And they still wanted her silent, still wanted her small, still wanted her to shrink into widowhood like a corset too tight to breathe. But Martha had no intention of shrinking, and what she was building next wouldn't fit under the earth. It would rise. It would prove, not just to them, but to anyone who ever believed usefulness had a gender, that the future would not be built by men who hoarded firewood and pride. It would be something no man could explain away or claim as his own. Not an idea, a structure. Something public, something undeniable. And when it was done, there wouldn't be a single soul in that town who could look at her again and say, she's just a woman. Because what she had in mind now would change everything. There wasn't a name for it yet. What she planned had no precedent. Not in town, not in the surrounding settlements, not in any book she could get her hands on. The traveling merchant who came through twice that winter spoke of things like smoke rooms in Lapland or ash-insulated huts among the far Alaskan tribes. But he said it like fables, not facts. And when Martha asked him if he'd ever seen one himself, he shook his head. Just stories, ma'am. I wouldn't know how to build one. But she did. Not from a single tale, but from the thread she'd pulled through them all. Earth held heat, fire wasted it, wind stole it, and the only way to survive wasn't to burn more, but to lose less. She'd done it once beneath the slope. Now she would do it above ground, and not just for her family, for everyone who'd been told they didn't have the right to shape their own warmth. She'd build a winter hall. The idea came to her while patching the boys' boots with horsehide scraps. They'd been wearing the same pair since autumn, and though she'd let out the seams twice, their toes had begun to curl for space. John, the eldest, was silent about it, too proud to complain. Thomas, the youngest, had burst into tears one morning when he couldn't get his foot in. That was what decided it. They weren't the only children suffering. Even with her root chamber sealed tight and rotating logs down to a science, there wasn't enough for others. Not space, not air, not time. But if she could build a larger structure, one that didn't require each family to have their own heat source, one that could serve as a communal gathering point, a place for children to warm during the day, for food to cook without 6 separate stoves bleeding fuel, then she could do more than survive. She could free people, even from their own pride. She didn't ask permission. She went up the hill with nothing but a cart, 2 boys, and a pile of clay scraped from the floodplains south of the river, still damp even in winter thanks to an underground spring. They started with a trench, longer this time, about 20 feet, and curved slightly at one end, not circular. She wanted airflow. At the bottom she laid stone, then ash, then flat clay bricks she molded by hand and cured in the heat of her existing chamber over 4 days. Next came the walls. She didn't have lumber, she had bones, not real bones, but that's what they looked like. Old wagon spokes, broken chairs, the remains of a collapsed barn. They curved and bent, lashed together at angles, bound with sinew and twine. On top of them, she packed mud-soaked burlap, soaked in lard, then sealed with a crust of clay and straw. The roof was the hardest part. She dug into the slope again, using it as a natural brace. Instead of lifting a roof, she lowered the hill into her structure, using gravity and angle to slope earth onto the frame, packing it tight until it formed a dome that the wind couldn't touch. Then came the heat channels. 3 vents, one for air intake, one for smoke, one for residual steam. She crafted them out of scavenged stovepipes, patched with mud, and wrapped in copper wire she'd stripped from a busted telegraph line near the edge of town. Inside the center of the structure, she placed a hollow basin of stone lined with soot and crushed glass. When she lit a single log in its base and covered it with a curved iron lid, a former wagon wheel rim, it burned for nearly 7 hours without a single gust of wind. The first day it stood finished, no one came, not even curious children. They watched from a distance, assuming madness. The second day, a widow named Lorna stopped by. Her cabin had lost its door to rot, and the local carpenter had offered to fix it for a price she couldn't pay. Martha led her inside the hall, lit one log, sealed the chamber, and waited. 2 hours later, Lorna fell asleep sitting upright, warm for the first time in weeks. The next morning, she returned with her child. By the third day, 6 more came, some with food, some with nothing but hope. Martha told them to bring what they could, nothing more. They didn't understand how it worked, but they didn't need to. It worked. The strange dome on the hill, half swallowed by earth, warmed better than any cabin. It used less fuel. It made no smoke during operation once the intake sealed. And inside it, families gathered, not just to survive, but to exist, to rest, to talk, to remember they were still human, even in the heart of the cold. It became a sanctuary, and that's when the men came again, this time with law, official-looking papers, town council stamps, declarations. You're operating an unlicensed structure. This could pose a threat to the community. It's attracting vagrants. You've created a fire hazard. They brought 2 deputies and stood at the edge of her hill like conquering generals, pointing at the dome like it was a tumor. We need to take it down, one said. For everyone's safety. Martha stood between them and the hall, arms crossed, boots buried to the shin in snow, lips cracked with cold. Go ahead, she said. Tell the women inside. Tell the old man in the corner who hasn't stopped coughing in 2 months. Tell the boy missing a finger from frostbite. Tell them your firewood stacks are more important than their breath. The deputies hesitated. The councilman muttered. Then one of the women, Lorna, stepped out of the dome behind her. She held a baby in her arms. The child's cheeks were rosy, breathing easy. She said nothing, just looked at them, and the men left, for now. But Martha knew it wasn't over, because what scared them wasn't the structure. It was the idea that warmth didn't belong to them anymore, that solutions could be shaped by calloused hands, no longer waiting for permission, that a woman had taught the town to survive without its men, and no council, no meeting, no sheriff's paper could undo that. Still, the threats came quietly now. A nail through her water bucket, a stone thrown at the dome late at night, a sheep carcass dumped at her doorstep. They never signed their names. They didn't have to. She recognized the cowardice. It was the same tone they'd used at her husband's grave. But she didn't stop. She added a second chamber to the dome, then a third. By midwinter, the hall could hold 12 people. A cookstone sat in the back, sealed to prevent smoke, heated by residual heat drawn through a carved duct from the fire basin. She added a sleeping shelf for children, padded with hay and old furs. She created a home, and still, every log counted. Every ember was rationed. But it wasn't about comfort. It was about control, about reclaiming what had always been hers to shape. Her boys saw it, and so did others. One by one, women came to her alone, not with questions, but with plans. I have a slope. I think I can find stone. My uncle left a pipe in his shed. They weren't asking for help anymore. They were replicating. She became a seed, and the hill became a grove. Dozens of clay domes began sprouting behind cabins, between stables, at the edge of farms. Some failed, some collapsed, but some worked. And once something works in winter, it never dies. That was when the men stopped pretending. One night a fire was lit near her dome, not inside, but beside it, close enough to melt the slope, and crack the outer layer of clay. It didn't spread, but it damaged the vent. When she emerged the next morning, smoke still curled faintly where it shouldn't have, and someone had carved the words, "Not yours," into the snow beside it. She spent the next day sealing it again. Her boys helped. John didn't ask if they'd be safe. Thomas did. "Why don't they want us warm, Mama?" She stared at the pipe she was wrapping with new lard-soaked linen. "They don't want us warm," she said. "If it means they have to admit they were wrong." That night, 3 women stood outside her cabin with lanterns. Each had a hammer. They didn't ask what she needed help with. They only asked, "Where do we start?" The movement had begun, not out of vengeance, out of fire, out of breath, out of every frostbitten night when a woman had to pretend she didn't know better just to be left in peace. That peace was gone now, and in its place rose something bigger than winter. By the end of February, there were 17 domes across the foothills, some big enough for a family of 4, others barely more than crawl spaces. They weren't perfect, not by a long stretch, but they worked. Each one used less wood, breathed cleaner air, and kept its heat longer than any of the cabins in town. Every dome bore the unmistakable signature of the woman who'd started it all. A soot-blackened vent and a hatch cut into the slope that closed tighter than any town doorframe. They called them Willow's Halls, at first as a joke, then as a mark of respect, then finally as necessity. The name spread quietly. A traveler passing through remarked on them to a fur trader north of Elk Valley. A young widow visiting her sister drew diagrams by lantern light and took them back to her own township. A doctor from Coal Ridge, treating a girl for exposure, sat in one for 2 hours and asked questions the whole time. When he returned to his clinic, he built one for his patients to recover in. Still, Martha said nothing of it. She didn't need recognition. She needed the warmth to spread faster than the cold. But the colder it got, the clearer it became that warmth wasn't the only thing changing. The power was shifting too, and the men who had ruled the town, not with violence, but with habit and silence, could feel it. Not all resisted. Some came with open hands, asking earnestly how to build, how to pack, how to insulate. She showed them. Never denied them knowledge, not once. Not even to those who once spat at her boots, because it wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. But others, those with titles, those who ran things on paper, those who'd built their identity on the idea that only men could shape the world, grew bolder in their bitterness. Graf, the merchant, began refusing trade to any woman who worked on dome structures. He claimed it was due to limited inventory, but somehow his shelves were never empty for the sheriff or the blacksmith or any man with a frostbitten chimney. The council began drawing new lines. Building codes were suddenly updated. Gathering places required supervision. And the Willow's Halls, once hailed as miracles in whispers, became unregulated hazards in the mouths of the loudest men. A vote was held. Quietly, behind closed doors, they ruled the domes illegal, cited structural instability. And when Martha received the hand-delivered notice tacked to her cabin, it came with a stamped seal, a deputy's signature, and a deadline. Demolition within 10 days. No appeal. She read it once, then set it on the stove and watched the edges curl black. But she didn't speak of it to the town. Instead, she worked through the night, tightening the structure, resealing the upper cracks, reinforcing the outer slope with branches and hay. It would hold. She'd make sure it held, but it wasn't about her dome anymore. It was about every one of the women who had copied her, adapted her, passed her design along like a secret hand stitched into a pocket. It was about the way little Thomas had stopped coughing altogether since sleeping in the dome. It was about how John had begun teaching other children how to line clay walls, and how he stood a little taller every time someone asked him what his mama had built. It was about the girl with frostburned legs who hadn't cried once since crawling into the warm basin of the Willow's Hall beside the church ruins. So when the men came again, this time with hammers, nails, and a sheriff's order to deconstruct her structure for inspection, they found a wall of women waiting, not armed, not screaming, just standing, silent, mothers, daughters, widows, a few boys even, and one man with no home who had spent 3 weeks in Martha's dome, slowly recovering from a lung infection the sawmill air had nearly made fatal. They didn't speak until the sheriff dismounted and stepped forward. "Miss Willows," he said, voice tight, "I need you to step aside. I've got lawful orders." She met his eyes. "This land's mine." He held up the paper. "Law says otherwise now." "Then your law's wrong. It's been voted." "I didn't vote." He hesitated. She took a step forward, quiet as falling snow. "Sheriff," she said, "I've fed your son in that dome. He slept there last week when your chimney gave out. Don't think I didn't know." The sheriff's mouth opened, then shut again. He glanced at the women, then at the children. No one moved. It wasn't violence. It wasn't mutiny. It was something older, a refusal, a collective stillness, stronger than muscle. He left with the men. No dome was touched. But that night, her chimney was knocked over. Not the domes. The one on her cabin. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to force her back into dependence, back into the wooden structure that creaked and froze and wasted fire. They wanted to take away the proof that she had done something impossible. She didn't rebuild the chimney. She moved into the dome full time. That was the line. The town divided. Women followed her. Men, afraid or angry, clustered tighter around the council's authority. A new ordinance came down, harsh and fast. No structures larger than 10 feet. No earthen materials without inspection. No shared chambers without council registration. And above all, no public gatherings in unauthorized dwellings. The next morning, a woman was arrested. Sarah Mendon, 31, mother of 2, pregnant with a third. She'd hosted a soup circle in her dome. 6 people, no fire, just a pot, a vent, and a group of children learning how to string lard cloth. They pulled her out barefoot, dragged her to the jailhouse. Her dome was torn down, and the message was clear. Martha went to the jail that night, not to argue, to stand. She said nothing, just waited outside the barred window until the sheriff came out onto the porch, rubbing his arms, face pale from the cold. "I can't stop them," he said softly. "You are them?" He didn't answer. "Your boy's cough came back yet?" she asked. He shook his head, looked ashamed. "Don't let them take that away from him," she said. "Don't let them bury what we know works just because they can't control it. I don't know what to do." "Then don't do anything. Just stand still." And slowly, that's what began to happen. The men stopped enforcing the rules, not publicly, but their boots stepped slower. Their eyes drifted when others crossed lines. One deputy forgot to deliver 2 demolition notices. Another lost a list of unregistered domes. The sheriff missed a gathering of 20 women singing hymns in a dome outside town limits. They didn't change the laws. They just stopped obeying them, because even those men deep down knew that what Martha had built didn't threaten the town. It saved it. And by March's end, the worst of the cold broke. The snow softened. The sun rose earlier, and no one had died. No one, not a single person, lost to exposure or starvation or fire. It was the first winter in town history with no deaths from cold. They didn't hang a banner. No one held a parade. But the silence of that statistic rang louder than church bells. They all knew why. And though no one gave her a title, no one stood up at the chapel to say her name in thanks. Everyone knew who had turned the tide. They still muttered it in private, still whispered, "That woman." But no one said just a woman anymore, because by then, every breath in every dome was proof that just was never part of what she'd been. And the next season, she wasn't done, not by a long shot, because if one log could heat a dome, what else could it do? The snow receded, but the memory of cold did not. Even as the mud returned to the roadways and birds began their hesitant calls from the timberline, no one in the valley could look at the slope above Martha Willows's cabin without feeling something stir beneath their ribs. Some called it unease, some awe. Most didn't name it at all, but it was there, stitched into the ground now. Heat where there should have been hunger, breath where there should have been stillness. And Martha, she wasn't content, because it had never been about a single winter. She'd lived long enough to know one good season didn't mean the next would spare you. If anything, it made men soft again. She'd seen it before. A mild spring lured people back into the rhythm of forgetting what frost does to a child's foot, what an empty stove does to a mother's hands, what silence does to hope. But she hadn't forgotten, she never would. And what she had in mind next wasn't shelter, it was independence. Because what she'd built still required fire, still required wood, less, yes, but not none. And wood could still be controlled, hoarded, priced, stolen. And she'd seen it already. Men gathering up the downed trees from the melt, dragging them into fenced lots, posting signs, "For sale, council-approved timber." It made her stomach turn. So one morning, before the town had finished yawning, she took John and Thomas to the riverbank, half a mile west of the chapel ruins. There, near a bend where the earth rose just high enough to avoid the worst of the floods, she'd found something. Not firewood, not stone, but fuel. Deep beneath the mud, the silt was black, rich with peat, compressed grasses, and ash, and years of rot. It burned slow, and when packed properly, held a glow longer than pine or birch ever could. Her husband had once mentioned it, offhand, when clearing brush. Might be worth drying someday. He never got to it. She would. The boys dug, she shaped. They formed bricks, thick, wide, like loaves of bread, and stacked them on a slanted rack made of willow branches. Over the next week they dried until hard as rock, then cracked with just enough give to catch a flame. One log could now be stretched twice as far, if paired with a peat brick beneath it. It was a start. But again, Martha thought bigger. There were women who'd never even touched a log before this winter. Widows, girls, elderly women, wives whose husbands still refused to enter a dome out of pride. All of them had learned to shape clay, pack soot, burn cleaner. Now she'd teach them to fuel. So she wrote it out, by hand, a guide. 8 pages, folded and stitched along the side with thread she pulled from an old grain sack. On the front she didn't put her name, just a title. Warmth from Earth, a mother's guide to winter fire. She made 12 copies, left them in the chapel ruins. By sunrise they were gone. 2 weeks later, she made 20 more, still gone by morning. By the 3rd printing, someone had rewritten her title in charcoal across the chapel wall. The woman who burns dirt better than firewood. They meant it as a joke, but she took it for what it was, a signal. The ground was shifting, and then came the reporter. He arrived on horseback, boots too clean for a man who claimed to have ridden from St. Louis, voice like ink, slow, deliberate, too used to being heard. His name was Prentice. Leather-bound journal in hand, he approached the dome without knocking. Martha met him at the slope. He tipped his hat. "Miss Willows?" She said nothing. "I'm with the Evening Telegraph. Heard there's a woman out here keeping folks warm with dirt and scraps." Still nothing. He thumbed the corner of his journal. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" She looked past him, to the trees, the thawing ridgeline, the boys, watching silently from the edge of the field, mud-streaked, but standing tall. Then she turned and walked back into the dome. The reporter followed. He asked everything, what she built, how it worked, where the idea came from, what it meant. She answered plainly, never embellishing, never selling herself. "I needed my boys warm. But now it's more than just your boys," she shrugged. "Didn't mean for it to be." He looked around, ran a hand over the clay arch, lit a match near the vent just to see the drawer. "This is no accident," he said. "This is revolutionary." She frowned. "It's dirt and fire." He laughed. "It's independence." And there it was. He saw it, not just warmth, but what it meant. He asked for a sketch. She drew one on the back of a meal ledger. He took it, left the next day. She didn't expect anything from it. But 2 weeks later, men from 3 towns over came with their wives, holding charcoal-copied diagrams. They called her Miss Firemother, said the Telegraph had run the story on the front page, that city men were scoffing, but farmers were listening, that a preacher had read the article aloud from a pulpit, said it was blasphemy turned into shelter. And with that came the letters, dozens, then hundreds, written by hand, passed from trader to traveler, postmarked from names she couldn't pronounce. Some praised her, some begged her, some asked how to begin. She read every one, replied to most, dictated when her hands cramped, had John write when her eyes gave out. She sent back sketches, corrections, tips, what kind of clay held best, how to patch leaks, how to bury vents for airflow, and in return, they sent thanks. One woman from Montana mailed a snow-dried rabbit pelt. A widow from Kansas carved her name into a wooden box and said she kept her newborn inside it, near the dome's warm wall. A girl from Arkansas said, "Mama says you saved us, and she's going to name my sister after you." Martha cried for the first time in months reading that. But even joy, when piled too high, can turn heavy, and not everyone was pleased. That spring, the council met again. A formal decree was written, a new regulation. No non-standardized dwellings to be constructed without council consent or male oversight. This time, they meant to enforce it. They deputized 6 new men, trained them with axes and demolition tools, labeled the dome's contagion risks and morally dubious. They claimed Martha was starting a cult, that she was undermining family order, that women were becoming confused about their place, but it was too late, because by then, the domes weren't just in town. They were on the road, on the ridge, built by travelers, refugees, runaways, farmers too poor for lumber, miners without land. And by then, Martha's sketches had been copied by hand so many times, no one even knew who first drew them. It wasn't hers anymore. It was theirs. The townsfolk warned her. "They're coming," Lorna whispered one morning. 3 days from now, to tear it down, to make an example." Martha nodded. She didn't flinch. Instead, she gathered her boys, packed what she could, and walked into the dome for the last time. She lit a single log, then added 3 peat bricks, then sealed the chamber. She sat between her sons, held their hands, and waited. Because this time, she didn't need to stop the men. This time, the town would do it for her. Because when the councilman rode up the slope with tools and torches and declarations, they found a line of townsfolk already waiting. Not just women, everyone. Men who'd slept in the domes when their cabins burned. Children who'd learned to walk without frostbite. Old men who'd once mocked her, now standing with folded arms. Even the sheriff. He held no badge now, just a shovel. And when the lead councilman barked, "Step aside, all of you," no one moved. Not even when the deputies raised their torches. Not even when the sun burned behind them like a warning. Because they all knew now. The dome wasn't just structure. It was proof. That one woman, mocked, abandoned, doubted, had outlasted a winter no one else was ready for, and they weren't about to let the proof burn, so the men turned back. And Martha, she didn't cheer, she didn't cry, she simply looked down at her boys, squeezed their hands, and whispered, "It's yours now." They never came back, not with torches, not with paper, not with laws. After that morning, after being turned away not by a woman, but by a town united behind her, no one tried again. The council didn't dissolve, but it fell silent. Meetings went unattended, decrees remained unsigned. Graf shuttered his shop without announcement, and the men who once strutted through the streets with shoulders high and hands full of hammers now walked like men made small by something they couldn't name but knew they could no longer deny. The people didn't just stand with Martha Willows. They followed her. They learned, and then they taught. Her methods weren't words anymore. They were inheritance. They moved from mother to daughter, from cabin to wagon, from hill towns to dry plains where the sun bit hard but the nights froze deeper than bones. And as spring dragged its boots across the thawing land, the domes didn't disappear. They multiplied. But Martha wasn't finished, because she'd seen the same pattern in her own town repeat elsewhere. Letters came from places where domes were outlawed, where husbands refused to let their wives muck in clay like pigs, where pastors preached that earth should not be shaped by women, where women were fined, threatened, cast out, and, more than once, buried after dome collapses caused by stolen designs built wrong on purpose. The movement had grown, but it hadn't yet stabilized, so she changed course. She stopped building, started training. She created what she called the 4 fingers, 4 core steps that must never be skipped in any dome design: foundation, fire trap, vent path, retention wrap. She drew them by hand over and over, carving them into stone slates, etching them into tin sheets, burning them into bark with a hot nail. Whatever material someone could carry, she used. John and Thomas helped. By now they could build a dome in 3 days flat. The boys had grown into their feet. John's hands were the size of her husband's. He'd begun crafting new tools, curved spatulas, soot mixers, even molds for forming uniform peat bricks. Thomas, younger but sharper, became her voice, reading letters aloud, writing instructions, copying diagrams. The dome was no longer a thing to be hidden in a hill. It was a system, and as word spread, so did the pressure. Not from her town, that battle was won, but from the outside. It started with a letter from a man calling himself Engineer Hawthorne, typed, precise. He claimed to represent the Western Hearth Commission, a committee she'd never heard of. He praised her methods, called them ingenious, then asked if she'd like to submit her knowledge formally for review and standardization. Standardization. The word sat heavy in her chest. She didn't reply. Another letter followed, then another. By the 4th, they stopped asking and started assuming. A draft certification arrived, one that claimed all domes must now pass through the Hearth Commission for approval before construction. Her designs, it said, were welcome to serve as a foundation, but only once validated by a panel of trained men in thermodynamic safety and structural logic. She burned it, but she didn't speak of it to others. Not yet. Because while strangers were now reaching for her work like it was gold, the truth was the dome didn't belong to anyone anymore. It belonged to the cold, and anyone who had stood between a child and the cold knew the dome wasn't a theory. It wasn't something you filed and approved and regulated. It was survival. That's why she refused to claim ownership. When a man from Coleridge rode in with a printing press and offered to publish her name on a book titled The Willows Method, she refused. When a preacher came offering to name her patron saint of clay fire, she turned him away. When a governor's man showed up asking if she'd like a state medal for innovative frontier resilience, she handed him a peat brick and said, "You'll understand more if you light it yourself." She didn't want monuments. She wanted the domes to spread, but she couldn't stop the outside from creeping in. That spring, 2 traders from Helena brought in a dome kit, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with brass clips, boasting stamped steel joints and instruction cards written in 5 languages. "Build it in a day," they shouted from the market square. "Heat your world the civilized way." They'd copied her. Badly. The joints were too stiff, the vents too short. The clay wrap was synthetic, full of lime, not local soil. They'd even cut the fuel trench in half to save space. It didn't hold heat, but they sold 5 kits before sundown. And when one collapsed on a family 2 towns over, killing a mother and child in their sleep, the guilt sat in Martha's throat like a stone she couldn't swallow. That night, she walked out into the dark alone. She passed her own dome, the one still breathing warmth through its chimney hole, past the rows of now empty clay pits where others had begun drying bricks for summer heat retention trials, past the chapel ruins where her first pamphlets had been stolen in gratitude. She walked to the river, sat in the silt, and sobbed, not because she'd failed, but because they were failing her. The world that had ignored her, mocked her, stolen from her, now wanted to own her creation without ever understanding it. She cried until the moon crept overhead, and the chill settled into her skirt. She would have sat there until morning, but John found her. He didn't speak, just sat beside her, hand in hers. Then finally, after a long while, he said, "We should start a school." She laughed. "A hollow thing. We don't have a schoolhouse. We don't need one," he said. "We've got domes." She turned to him. He didn't smile. He meant it. "We teach them before they copy it wrong. We show them, not tell them, one dome at a time." And somehow, she knew it wasn't madness. It was the way forward. The next week, she wrote a call letter. Just 2 sentences. "If you have built a dome and it held, come here. Bring your hands. We will teach others how to build with the truth, not with pride." They hung it in the chapel wall, carved it into tree bark along the trails. By midsummer, 15 women arrived. 3 from Missouri, 2 from Idaho. One who didn't speak English but brought her child and a book of sketches. They weren't architects. They were keepers of warmth. And Martha taught them every detail she'd ever learned: where clay dried fastest, what stone cracked under pressure, which wood made steam and which made smoke, how to hear the chamber breathing at night. She called it listening for the pulse. She taught them how to build in sand, in shale, in mud, in mountain scree. She gave them each a bundle: clay scoop, soot knife, peat mold, and most of all, the 4 fingers. And then she sent them out. They didn't just build, they taught. They became known as the Clay Daughters. No titles, no uniforms, just soot on their hands and warmth at their backs. Everywhere they went, they left a dome. Every dome bore a sign, not with Martha's name, but 4 carved marks: a foundation, a swirl, a wave, a wrap, the 4 fingers, the language of warmth. No man could standardize it now, because it had already become scripture. And Martha, she returned to her dome, not to rest, but to prepare, because that winter another storm was coming. And this one wouldn't just be snow and wind. It would be men in suits, and she was ready, not with fire, with knowledge, because they could take tools, they could take papers, but they couldn't take what lived in her hands, what she'd taught her boys, what she'd passed to strangers, what she'd sown across the dirt like seeds. They'd mocked her once, called her just a woman, but now the very world was warming itself with the silence she had broken, and they'd never mock her again. The first men arrived dressed like snow, clean coats, pale gloves, papers tucked under their arms like weapons no one saw coming. They didn't ride in with fire or threats. They didn't raise their voices or wear expressions of contempt. No, these men wore concern. They came smiling, gentle, reasonable. Their language was soft and threaded with kindness. "Miss Willows," said the one in the grey coat, "we come only to help organize. There's been a lot of excitement about your invention. We'd like to help guide it safely." She didn't answer. He went on, a voice like warm milk. "We've drawn up a standard, a universal guideline, a licensing path. It protects you, protects the users, ensures quality across the board. We've had engineers revise the dimensions. They say the venting design could be modernized." Martha said nothing. "You'll be credited, of course," said the second man. "We've even considered a patent. Your name will be on it, permanently." Still, she said nothing. "We can ensure these domes don't fall into misuse," the third man said. "It's a good thing you've started, but movements, you understand, require structure, and we're here to provide it." And then, very gently, the first man added, "The world is ready to move past mud huts, Miss Willows. Let's help it along, together." She stared at them. 3 sets of polished boots, 3 faces that hadn't known what a single frostbitten night felt like, 3 sets of lungs that had never tasted soot from a single log fire, fighting for life. She didn't speak, but she opened the dome, not to explain it, to show it. They stepped inside, confident, joking, but within 5 minutes, they had gone quiet. By 10, they'd removed their coats. By 15, the grey-coated man had touched the stone-lined floor and muttered, "Impossible." "It's not," she said. "That's the problem." They stayed a full hour. When they emerged, blinking like men who'd stepped out of something holier than science, they asked her again, softly now, "Will you let us help standardize this?" And she finally answered, "I don't need your help. I need your absence." They tried again. A second visit, this time with a 4th man, older, heavier, whose words were all dipped in legal ink. He asked if she'd at least sign an agreement, that no one else could claim her designs, that she'd be protected. "Protected from what?" she asked. "From yourself," he said. "From imitators, from misuse. I don't want protection," he blinked. "I want replication." And that was the last time they came, because they knew they'd lost, not just her, the world. By the following spring, domes were sprouting from coast to coast. Letters stopped, replaced by messengers, messengers replaced by builders. Women who came, learned, stayed a while, then disappeared down the trail to teach others. They called themselves nothing. They named no leader. They carried nothing but soot and sketches. The clay daughters moved faster than trains. They outpaced maps. And Martha? She faded. Not in spirit, not in work, but in visibility. She stopped speaking at gatherings, stopped responding to every request. The people knew now. They didn't need her in every room. They needed her in the dirt, where she worked best. Quiet, focused, leaving behind warmth without fanfare. She grew older, her hair silvered, her eyes dimmed at the edges, but her hands, those hands, never forgot the texture of cold earth or the tension of packed soot between the fingers. Her sons built homes now, stone-walled, clay-vented, peat-brick-fueled. John married a woman from the Dakota domes. Thomas carved domes into river stones as gifts for travelers. They both built schools, not of books, but of breath and clay and fire. One day a wagon rolled into town, from the east, with a plaque. It bore her name, the Martha Method. It read, founder of the fire within. The boys were excited. She wasn't. That night she smashed it with a hammer, not out of anger, out of belief, because her name was not the warmth. The method was not a monument. It was living, and the living did not need to be carved into still stone to prove they mattered. Instead, she lit a fire, just one log and 3 peat bricks, and inside the dome she scratched 4 simple symbols into the packed clay wall. Her final mark, the 4 fingers. Below it, one sentence: if you are cold, build. If you are hungry, teach. If you are mocked, dig deeper. There is warmth beneath every doubt. She died one autumn night, peacefully, with her hand resting on clay, her breath warm, her body wrapped in lard cloth. No funeral, just a dome, sealed from the wind, holding her silence like a prayer. She was buried where the first dome had stood. Above her they built another, not to mourn, to remind that once, a woman the world tried to ignore built a fire the world could not put out, a fire that burned through pride, through fear, through paper and law and distance and time, a fire that needed only one log and a woman the cold couldn't kill.